Robert Henry Lawrence Jr.'s promising career as the first African-American astronaut was tragically cut short during a high-stakes space mission training in 1967. At just 32 years old, Lawrence was involved in a critical test flight aimed at mastering the steep descent glide technique, a maneuver crucial for spacecraft re-entry from orbit. Piloting an F-104 starfighter at Edwards Air Force Base, the mission took a disastrous turn when the aircraft, commanded by flight test trainee Major Harvey Royer, failed its landing approach. The plane crashed violently, catching fire and resulting in Lawrence's immediate death as his ejector seat malfunctioned, launching sideways. This mishap not only claimed his life, but also ended what could have been a groundbreaking chapter in space exploration, potentially positioning him to be among the elite group of astronauts in NASA's Space Shuttle program following the cancellation of the Manned Orbital Laboratory Initiative. Lawrence's legacy, however, continues to inspire, remembered for his contributions to aerospace technology and commemorated in memorials and tributes that underscore his pioneering role in space history.
This next mission was a very close call. It was actually completed, but was very close to ending in disaster. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 was a pretty historic space mission where American and Soviet spacecraft docked together in orbit. It marked an end in the space race and this easing in the Cold War tensions as the two countries were finally working together. Beautiful. And it all went pretty well, but the mission had a frightening end. On July 24th, 1975, as the American Apollo crew prepared for re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, they encountered a bit of a problem. During re-entry, a switch controlling the environmental control system was accidentally left in the wrong position, and this caused a nitrogen tetroxide gas leak, a toxic substance used as rocket propellant. As the gas filled the cabin, the astronauts Tom Stafford, Deke Slayton, and Vance Brand began to experience symptoms of poisoning: burning eyes, sore throats, and difficulty breathing. Brand lost consciousness, but Stafford managed to grab oxygen masks, placing one on Brand before giving one to Slayton and putting on his own. They managed to land safely in the Pacific Ocean. They were hospitalized for 2 weeks in Honolulu, Hawaii.
In the high-stakes world of space exploration, not every mission writes a story of triumph. On October 31st, 2014, the quest to conquer the final frontier faced a sobering setback when the VSS Enterprise, a space plane by Virgin Galactic, tragically disintegrated mid-air during a test flight in the Mojave Desert. This was not just another routine test. The space plane was testing a new, more powerful rocket engine, marking its first powered flight in 9 months. Tragically, the co-pilot Michael Alsbury lost his life, and pilot Peter Seibold sustained serious injuries. The breakdown occurred seconds after the spaceplane was released from its carrier aircraft. The National Transportation Safety Board later pinpointed the cause: a premature unlocking of the spacecraft's feathering system, an air brake designed for re-entry by Alsbury. This catastrophic human error was exacerbated by several systematic failures, including inadequate safety measures, deficient pilot training, and insufficient oversight from the FAA. Despite the immediate speculations blaming the new rocket engine, investigations confirmed that it functioned correctly, leaving the focus squarely on human factors and procedural safeguards.
The Apollo 12 mission, NASA's second manned mission to the moon, had a pretty scary start. On November 14th, 1969, just 36 seconds after liftoff, the spacecraft was struck by lightning. Then, about 16 seconds after that, it was struck again. These lightning strikes caused all 3 of the spacecraft's fuel cells to shut down, leading to a total loss of electrical power and the failure of the onboard guidance platform. In the command module, the crew, Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean, saw this sudden barrage of warning lights and alarms. The lightning strikes were caused by the rocket itself. As the Saturn V rocket climbed through the atmosphere, it basically acted as a giant lightning rod. Power needed to be restored, and fast. Flight controller John Aaron remembered a solution from a previous simulation that might have restored power, and the command was unfamiliar to the astronauts at first, but they followed his instructions and it worked, bringing the command module systems back online. So this stabilized the spacecraft's power and allowed the mission to continue. And with power restored, the astronauts reset the guidance platform and continued their journey. But there was this lingering concern. Mission Control was worried the lightning strikes may have damaged the explosive bolts that opens the command module's parachute compartment, and they decided not to tell the astronauts this because there was really nothing they could do. Either the parachutes would fail and the crew would die on re-entry, or they'd be fine. Well, Apollo 12 did manage to successfully complete its mission and returned safely, splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. So this Boeing Starliner situation has turned out to be quite the saga. For those that don't know, the mission was originally supposed to last just 8 days. Astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams launched in early June, but they've now been stuck in orbit for almost 3 months because of some problems with the Starliner capsule. So what happened? Well, there are a couple of big issues at play here. The main problem has to do with the reaction control thrusters, which are super important for maneuvering the spacecraft. During the approach to the International Space Station, 5 out of the 28 thrusters failed. That's a huge concern because if those thrusters don't work, it makes docking and undocking a real challenge. Imagine trying to park a car in like a tight space, but sometimes it just doesn't respond to your steering. Now imagine doing that in space, surrounded by multi-billion-dollar spacecraft and the ISS, which has been operational for over 25 years. Now, despite the thruster failures, the crew did manage to dock with the ISS, but the problems didn't stop there. There's also a helium leak. Some leaks were known before the launch, but then additional ones popped up during the flight. Monitoring helium levels is critical because they affect the capsule's ability to operate properly. If the helium levels drop too low, it could jeopardize the astronauts' safe return home, and they can't just fix the helium leak without engineers on board to troubleshoot, which means the astronauts are stuck waiting while engineers are working figuring out the problems on Earth. But a little update on this Starliner case, NASA is gearing up to bring back Butch Wilmore and Sonny Williams from the ISS. The SpaceX Dragon spacecraft is going to bring them home, which at the time of recording this is just preparing to launch today. The SpaceX flight was originally going to be a 4-person mission, but now they'll be launching with just 2 to make room for Wilmore and Williams. American astronaut Nick Hague and Russian astronaut Alexander Gorbanov will be flying the Dragon capsule to the ISS. Hague stated, "We're going to launch as a 2-person crew, and then we're going to land as a 4-person crew." Now, unfortunately, this doesn't mean an immediate rescue, though. Even with the Dragon spacecraft on the way, it's expected that Wilmore and Williams won't be back on Earth until February. The transition isn't simple. The stranded astronauts are going to have to learn how the Dragon works. Spacecrafts aren't like cars. You can't just hop in and operate it the same way you would with your other vehicle. Hague mentioned that the ground teams have been working with Wilmore and Williams to help them understand what they'll need to be doing inside the Dragon, but in the meantime, Wilmore and Williams are staying busy aboard the ISS, just helping with routine maintenance and continuing experiments. Williams mentioned how cool it'll be to fly in 2 different spacecraft. "We're testers, that's what we do," she said. So yeah, it really seems like they're making the best of their situation. Skylab was NASA's first space station, which launched in 1973 and was in operation until 1979. It was a groundbreaking project that gave us a ton of valuable information about life in space and how we could live and work there. But when most people think about Skylab, they remember the crash, which makes sense. It was kind of a big deal. NASA didn't really plan ahead for how Skylab would come back down. They knew it would eventually re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, but they underestimated the chaos that could ensue. They expected Skylab to last around 9 years, but the technology to control its descent just wasn't available back then. So there wasn't a solid plan for when it would come back to Earth. And at best case scenario, they thought they'd have a 1 in 152 chance of someone getting hurt. They tried to guide Skylab to the Indian Ocean with some rockets, and for the most part they succeeded. The bigger pieces landed in the ocean, which was great news, but some debris fell right over Australia. Thankfully, no one got hurt and nothing major was damaged. In fact, one guy even scored $10,000 for delivering a piece of Skylab debris to a newspaper. Authorities weren't thrilled though, and NASA got fined a whopping $400 for littering, which is like 10 cents for them. Anyway, things could have been a lot worse, but this was a bit of a wake-up call for them. Michael J. Adams was a skilled pilot and engineer, known for his role as one of the 12 astronauts flying the North American X-15, an experimental space plane. Now, on November 15th of 1967, Adams took part in his 7th X-15 flight. He achieved an impressive altitude of 266,000 feet, qualifying him as an astronaut. But as he began his descent, the X-15 began to experience severe aerodynamic pressure, leading to a violent, high-speed spin. By the time he descended to 65,000 feet, the aircraft was in a nosedive. The X-15 broke apart, and Adams became the first American astronaut to die during a space mission. On July 21st, 1961, the Mercury Redstone 4 mission, piloted by astronaut Virgil Gus Grissom, successfully launched. The spacecraft, nicknamed Liberty Bell 7, made a suborbital flight that lasted about 15 minutes. Everything seemed to be going well until the splashdown in the Atlantic Ocean. After a relatively smooth descent and successful parachute deployment, Grissom prepared for recovery, but then he heard a sudden thud. The hatch cover, designed to blow off in emergencies, unexpectedly exploded off the capsule, and now water was flooding in. Liberty Bell 7 began to sink. Grissom quickly unbuckled his harness, removed his helmet, and climbed through the hatch. Meanwhile, the recovery helicopters were still a couple miles away. Fortunately though, a nearby helicopter crew saw Grissom exit the sinking capsule, and he was hoisted up by the helicopter. But Liberty Bell 7 wasn't so lucky. It sank into the ocean, and it wasn't until 1999 that the spacecraft was recovered. The Mars Climate Orbiter launched on December 11th, 1998. It was a robotic space probe that was supposed to help us learn about Mars's climate, atmosphere, and surface changes. It was also supposed to serve as a communication relay for another mission called the Mars Polar Lander. But on September 23rd, 1999, contact with the spacecraft was lost. As the orbiter approached Mars, it was on a trajectory that brought it too close to the planet. It ended up either being destroyed in the atmosphere or flying away into orbit around the sun. Sure, it wasn't a crewed mission, but just think of the time, money, and effort it takes for these things. Imagine spending years and over $270 million on a project and then just watching it vanish away. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, there was a mix-up between measurement systems. NASA uses the metric system, but Lockheed Martin, the company that built the spacecraft, was using US customary units, so that's a pretty big oversight. A piece of software that calculated the thruster's total impulse was giving results in pound force seconds instead of the expected Newton seconds, so this mismatch messed with the navigation calculations, leading the orbiter to enter the Martian atmosphere at a much lower altitude than they had originally planned, about 110 kilometers instead of the intended 226. The team knew something was off. Just a day before the orbital insertion, the calculations showed the orbiter would be way too close to the surface, like dangerously close. Instead of skimming through the upper atmosphere as planned, it likely entered at such a low altitude that it either burned up or bounced off the thicker atmosphere. Some navigators had even raised concerns earlier about the trajectory, but the warnings were just brushed aside because they hadn't followed the proper documentation procedures. But in the end, NASA as a whole took responsibility for the failure.
Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Almaz. Almaz was a super secret Soviet military space station program that began in the early 1960s. Basically, there were 3 separate stations that were launched between 1973 and 1976, and they were crewed military recon stations. How they kept the whole thing more under wraps is that they designed them like civilian space stations. One of the stations failed shortly after achieving orbit, but the last 2 both were successful in their crew testing. Although there was success on these flights, the cost associated with them and the benefits of the program weren't matching up, so in the end it didn't go further than there, although the technology used in this program has of course gone on to inform others. In our number 9 spot today, we have Long March 2F. Last year in 2020, China claimed to have successfully launched and tested a quote reusable spacecraft, which is said to be a space plane that could be the key to frequent and low cost access to space, which is a crazy thing to say. While this is very exciting and could potentially help space exploration in very valuable ways, it is said that this particular mission still has quite a bit of mystery surrounding it. It is said that while the launch was viewed by people, the exact nature of the craft itself as well as what it did in space isn't quite clear. An unnamed military source that was quoted by the South China Post apparently said that there were many firsts during this launch, which is why everything is so secretive and secure. At the end of the day, all we can do is sit back, watch, and see what happens. Who knew there was so much drama in the space world? Well, I kind of guess everyone did. I mean, take a look at the space race. In our number 8 spot today, we have Corona. Speaking of the space race, if you're unfamiliar, it was the 20th century competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, and it certainly was something that the world had never seen before. Basically, it was each country trying to one-up each other on spaceflight technology and capabilities, and while this competition had its origins in the missile-based nuclear arms race, it also managed to create a lot of technological advancements in the world of space exploration. Doing recon was truly one of the first priorities of both of these countries when it came to actually going to space, and that is why from 1960 to 1972, a recon project with the now terrible nickname Corona was put into effect. Basically, this project was a series of strategic recon satellites that were produced and operated by the CIA Directorate of Science and Technology with additional help from the US Air Force. So basically, the most incredible minds and those with the highest security clearances were in on this top secret mission. These satellites were then used to provide photographic surveillance of both the Soviet Union and China. Basically, at the time, everyone was really worried about nuclear power, and this gave them the opportunity to peek behind the curtain and see what was really going on. In our number 7 spot today, we have Spaceship One. On July 26, 2007, there was an explosion that occurred at a rocket propulsion test site at the Mojave Air and Spaceport in California. This explosion caused the death of 3 people and 3 others had to be hospitalized for serious injuries. While there were details released about this event, the exact specifics of how this happened were kept shrouded in mystery for quite some time. Basically, the explosion occurred just 3 seconds after the start of a cold flow test of nitrous oxide, or laughing gas. The test was because, during the planned suborbital space trips, the nitrous oxide would then be used as an oxidizer to ignite a fuel of solid rubber, and the test was to check that the fuel system plumbing works, and it wasn't meant to ignite anything. There were about 7 people there for the test, but most of them were behind a barrier that is used when testing things like rockets. Because of the nature of the test, there would seemingly be no reason for it to explode, but it obviously still did, and the reason as to how and why was kept a secret from the public. In our number 6 spot today, we have Shenzhou-21. Not too long ago, China launched a satellite called Shenzhou-21 designed to test new ways to clean up space debris, which is super cool and actually really important. This is all fine and well, but here's where the mysterious part comes in. Basically, something else has joined in orbit with the satellite, and the US Space Force detected and cataloged it, and while they thought they knew what it was, it turns out that they don't because it's not acting as expected. They thought it was a type of rocket body, but now they're just left with more questions than answers. Now there are doubts about whether it even is this rocket body or if it is an entirely different object, and regardless, what is the plan with it? This is all a precarious situation as many world powers are testing out certain anti-satellite technologies, which of course would be problematic for all the other countries. There's a good chance that we will likely never know the entire truth about the purpose of what the object trailing Shenzhou-21 is, but it's for sure keeping the Air Force on the lookout, and the rest of us can just sit and speculate and hope it's nothing bad for us. In our number 5 spot today, we have the fallen astronaut. This isn't exactly a space mission, but it is something that happened in space, and not a lot of people know about it, and it certainly was not something NASA knew about before it took place. The fallen astronaut is an aluminum sculpture that was meant to depict an astronaut in a spacesuit. The piece was commissioned and placed on the moon by the crew of the Apollo 15 on August 1st, 1971. It is next to a plaque that lists the 14 names of the men who died, and the entire thing is meant to be a tribute and to commemorate the astronauts and cosmonauts who have died in the advancement of space exploration. This wasn't cleared prior to being done, but I think the important thing is that it was done. The sacrifice of those people cannot be overstated, and it was for the benefit of us all. Those people were brave and brilliant, and they deserve to be commemorated in the best way possible, on the moon itself. In our number 4 spot today, we have X-37B. In 2009, at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, they received a mysterious visitor at the Air Force's super-secret X-37B spaceplane returned from orbit. This spaceplane went on a record-breaking mission as the unmanned spacecraft was in orbit for the last 780 days before autonomously returning to Earth. While we obviously know about the return of this craft, we will likely never know about exactly what went on. The most information we have is that the Air Force Research Laboratory used the spaceplane as an orbital platform to conduct highly classified experiments. That is both super cool and super terrifying. Apparently the spaceplane deployed a few small satellites, and the experiments were meant to test different technologies from avionics to advanced propulsion systems. The return of this spaceplane actually marked the 5th successful mission for the plane, which is super impressive. While being very secretive, this plane captured the attention of many amateur spy satellite hunters, but it proved to be difficult to keep tabs on because the spaceplane had the ability to alter its orbit in space. That means it requires a lot of vigilance to keep track of, exactly like a super secret plane should. In our number 3 spot today, we have Artemis 1. This one is less of a top secret mission and more so on the side of being one you maybe haven't heard of because it hasn't quite happened yet. Artemis 1 is a planned uncrewed test flight that's a part of NASA's Artemis program. The Artemis program is a United States-led international human spaceflight program. Basically, the goal is to return humans to the moon, most specifically the South Pole area of the moon. The aim is to have humans there by 2025, and if successful, this would be the first crewed lunar landing mission since Apollo 17 that took place in 1972. That's wild! There's people in space right now, and we haven't taken a trip back to the moon since 1972? I'm just glad we're working on heading there. Artemis 1 is expected to launch no earlier than February of 22, but it is likely to get pushed back until the summer. And while we wait with bated breath, making sure everything is fully prepared for the mission is more important than rushing. This mission will be the first flight of the Orion MPCV, and it will be the certification for the Orion spacecraft as well as the Space Launch System launch vehicle to see if they are ready for crewed flights. If all goes well, crewed flights will begin with the second flight test, Artemis 2. In our number 2 spot today, we have an entanglement. Not too long ago, actually just over a week ago as of filming this video, Russia successfully launched a classified military satellite that is said to be a part of Moscow's early warning anti-missile system. Just shortly after this, like we're talking just hours after this, China also had a space launch. They launched their Xi'an-11 satellite into space, which is thought to be in a testing or trial phase right now, with its eventual mission being kept a secret. While all of this is of course fine and well, the one concerning thing is that people are starting to speculate that perhaps these missions might be linked and that there is a possibility that Russia and China are working together out in space. Who knows really, and there's a high chance that this is just a space coincidence, and I'm not trying to start a space gossip column. Either way, whatever this test satellite is that China launched, we don't know what it will one day be used for, but we can all wait together because whatever it is, it's likely to be probably exciting. In our number 1 spot today, we have the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. Okay, so you remember the Soviet Union's secret Almaz mission we talked about at the beginning of this video in number 10? Well, here's another mission that was like in response to that. Basically, this program called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory was run by the Air Force and the intelligence community's National Reconnaissance Office, and the goal of it was to spy on and throw the Soviet Union off track. Some of the documents in this mission have now been declassified, and according to them, one of the goals was to knock some of Moscow's satellites out of orbit or to fire projectiles at them. They even wanted to try and capture one of the Soviet satellites in space and then basically send it back down to Earth so that they could study it. That's wild! And here's the thing that I couldn't tell you before about the Almaz that I can tell you now. Moscow equipped their secret space station with a rapid-fire cannon in order to stop any of this from happening. I seriously feel like I'm watching some sort of space action movie. I can't believe these are real things that happened and were created in the 60s and 70s of all the times.
The Mars Polar Lander, or MPL for short, was another one of NASA's big hopes for exploring Mars, specifically its polar regions. It was launched in January of 1999. The MPL was designed to gather information about water on Mars and whether the planet might have once supported life. After a long journey, it finally reached Mars in December, and everyone was very excited. The lander began its descent, and then silence. Communication with MPL just stopped. NASA spent a whole month trying to contact it, but nothing worked. Eventually, they had to face the reality. The mission was a total failure. So what happened? Well, the leading theory is that during the descent, the MPL's onboard computers got some mixed signals. It seemed like it was touching down, even though it was still quite a distance from the surface. Believing it had landed safely, the computers shut off the engines. This led to a hard crash instead of a gentle touchdown. But again, that's just a theory. To this day, we still don't know exactly what went wrong. Moving on now to the Orbital Carbon Observatory, or the OCO. This was going to be used to measure Earth's CO2 levels. Launched on February 24, 2009, it had 9 years of hard work and a $270 million investment behind it. Everyone was excited about what the OCO could do, but it never made it out of our atmosphere. Instead, it plummeted back down and crashed into the Indian Ocean near Antarctica. And it was all thanks to a minor problem that snowballed into a massive one. When rockets launch, they have this protective cover called a payload fairing that shields the satellite during ascent, but in OCO's case, the fairing didn't detach as it was supposed to. This extra weight meant that the rocket didn't have enough power to break free from Earth's atmosphere. Almost a decade spent building something, and then it just falls back to Earth because of a single glitch. On February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated on re-entry over Texas and Louisiana. All 7 astronauts on board were killed, making it the second catastrophic failure in the Space Shuttle program following the Challenger disaster in 1986. The shuttle launched from Kennedy Space Center on January 16th of 2003 after multiple delays. The crew, which had been selected back in July of 2000, included Commander Rick Husband, pilot William McCool, payload commander Michael Anderson, flight engineer Kalpana Chawla, and mission specialists David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, who was the first Israeli astronaut. About 81 seconds into the flight, a piece of foam insulation broke off from the external tank. The foam hit Columbia's left wing at a high speed. During the mission, a team was set up to assess the damage, but they downplayed the risk, believing that there had been foam strikes before which hadn't caused any serious issues. And when it came time to re-enter the atmosphere on February 1st, the crew began their preparations. Little did they know that the damage to the left wing had allowed hot gases to penetrate the shuttle's structure. And during re-entry, Columbia began to experience a series of failures. Just moments before losing communication, the crew sensed something was wrong, but they didn't have time to react. At 9 a.m., Columbia broke apart, scattering debris across several states. On January 27, 1967, a fire broke out during a pre-launch test for the Apollo 1 mission. The astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee, were conducting what's called a plugs out test. They were strapped into their seats in the command module, ready to conduct a simulated launch. The test was going to be low risk because the spacecraft wasn't fueled and all the explosive systems were disabled, but during the test, Grissom smelt a strange odor in the cabin, describing it as similar to sour buttermilk. Though air samples were taken, no cause for the smell was identified. Then at 6:31 p.m., a fire erupted in the cabin. Grissom was the first to alert ground control, exclaiming "Fire!" just moments before total chaos ensued. The cabin was filled with pure oxygen, making the fire spread rapidly. Grissom's microphone picked up sounds of scuffling and panic as the crew tried to escape, but in seconds, they were engulfed in flames. It took nearly 5 minutes to reach the crew, and when they finally entered the module, they found the astronauts' bodies partially fused to the interior. It's one of the most horrific incidents in NASA's history.
Set the scene. March 1965. The Voskhod 2 mission is orbiting Earth with cosmonauts Pavel Belyayev and Alexei Leonov on board. This Soviet space saga was about to take a wild turn as Leonov stepped into the cosmic limelight, becoming the first human to walk in space. That's right, he floated right out of the spacecraft in a specially designed spacesuit, aiming for a brief yet breathtaking 12-minute jaunt among the stars. Now, while that might sound like a space enthusiast's dream come true, it definitely wasn't all smooth sailing. or spacewalking. Leonov's suit ballooned up like a parade float, making it tough to get back into the airlock. Imagine trying to squeeze like a puffed up marshmallow through a straw. That was basically what Leonov was doing, struggling to bend his joints to fit back inside of the craft. He had to bleed off some of the suit pressure, which is just as risky as it sounds, just to maneuver his way back in. Back inside, unfortunately, the troubles didn't stop. The hatch was a nightmare to seal thanks to some thermal warping, and the re-entry was a doozy because their landing system glitched, forcing them to switch to manual controls. And the cherry on top? They landed hundreds of kilometers off target in a forest teeming with wildlife, where they spent a chilly night waiting for rescue. It was an absolutely wild ride from start to finish, with moments of danger that really tested the cosmonauts' mettle and survival skills.
In July of 2013, an Italian astronaut named Luca Parmitano had a pretty horrifying experience on the International Space Station that caused a job to be cut short. He had water leaking into his spacesuit during a spacewalk. A malfunctioning spacesuit, I mean, that has to be up there as one of the worst nightmares for any astronaut. I mean, god damn. As he was working, water began to leak into his helmet, and because, in space water behaves differently than on Earth, it was floating all around him, making it difficult for him to hear, see, or talk to the other astronauts. Bit of an issue. And this wasn't water you'd be able to drink either. It was leaking from the liquid cooling system in his suit, so not safe to consume. And besides, trying to swallow floating water blobs in zero gravity, that'd be a challenge. So the spacewalk was cut short for safety reasons, lasting just over an hour, making it one of the shortest in the ISS's history. Thankfully, Parmitano made it back inside the ISS safely, albeit pretty shaken up, I'd have to imagine.
This story is a little unlike the others we are talking about today because this scenario unfolded during a survival training mission rather than something related to actually going to space. In a tragic twist of fate, a Russian cosmonaut, Sergei Vazovikov, met his untimely end during what was supposed to be just a routine survival training session. According to the RIA news agency, he was embarking on a solo adventure, attempting to snag his dinner from the sea, a test to hone his self-sufficiency in the wild. Unfortunately, the sea had other plans. While fishing, Sergei slipped and plunged into the icy waters. To make matters worse, a hidden menace lurked below, a poacher's abandoned fishing net. The current, unforgiving and swift, ensnared him in this underwater trap, unfortunately sealing his fate.
The NASA Columbia disaster happened on February 1st, 2003. The space shuttle broke apart as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere, resulting in the loss of all 7 astronauts on board. During launch on January 16th, a piece of foam insulation from the external fuel tank had broken off and struck the left wing of the shuttle. Now at first, no one realized how serious the damage really was. They didn't think it was a big deal because similar foam incidents had happened before without causing any major problems. So NASA did some investigations, they considered sending a rescue mission, but ultimately they believed the shuttle would be able to make it back safely. But that wasn't the case. The foam had damaged the thermal protection system on the wing, which shields the shuttle from the intense heat of re-entry. So as Columbia re-entered Earth's atmosphere, hot gases entered the wing, causing it to just snap off, and the entire shuttle disintegrated. The debris scattered over Texas and Louisiana.
Apollo 1 was set to make space history as the inaugural crewed mission of NASA's ambitious project aimed at moonwalking. However, the mission tragically ended before it even began. On January 27, 1967, during a pre-launch test at Cape Kennedy, a devastating cabin fire claimed the lives of all 3 astronauts on board: Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. What was supposed to be a routine rehearsal spiraled into disaster, exposing fatal flaws in the spacecraft's design, notably its highly flammable environment exacerbated by a pure oxygen atmosphere. The investigation that followed pointed to an electrical fault as the likely spark that set off the fire, which was fueled by the cabin's nylon materials and constrained by a hatch that couldn't be opened quickly enough. The aftermath was a mix of soul-searching and sweeping reforms at NASA, which grounded crewed flights for nearly 2 years, while engineers reworked the spacecraft's safety features. This tragedy not only reshaped NASA's procedures and designs, but also marked a very solemn moment of reflection on the risks astronauts take. Apollo 1, a mission that never flew, left a legacy of lessons that propelled future space exploration.
Alright, and of course we have the tragic Challenger disaster of 1986. The Challenger was a NASA space shuttle, and on this particular mission there were 7 crew members. The main task was to release a communications satellite into orbit and to study Halley's Comet. The shuttle took off as planned, but just 73 seconds into the flight, disaster struck. The spacecraft suddenly broke apart in mid-air, leading to the deaths of all 7 crew. The cause of the explosion was later determined to be a problem with one of the rocket boosters. On that day, the weather was unusually cold, and this had an effect on the rubber O-rings, which were supposed to seal the joints in the booster rockets. They didn't function properly because of the low temperature, and as a result, there was a leak of hot gas from one of the boosters. And this leak weakened the structural integrity of the shuttle's external fuel tank, causing it to rupture. The force of the explosion tore the spacecraft apart, leading to the tragic loss of the entire crew. Hats off to astronauts for, honestly just risking their life. I mean, there's like a 50-50 chance they're not coming back.
Probably higher, honestly.
Man.
Like,
yeah.
I guess we'd have to look at how many astronauts have actually been to space, and then how many didn't quite make it, or didn't make it back. Such is the way of space exploration. It's crazy out there.
Well, I've been your host, James.
I've been your other host, Olivia, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Want to see even more awesome videos from us? Check out this video next. It's about prohibited locations from around the world that you are not allowed to go. Come check out this fascinating video right now. What are you waiting for? Click the video now.